Good morning, and welcome to University College London. My name is Dr. Nathaniel Adam Tobias Coleman, and whether you're in the audience in this room today, or whether you're watching from somewhere around the world, we are delighted that you have decided to join us. Our society has constructed certain racial boundaries, but it has also contested those very racial boundaries. Indeed, it has even gone as far as crossing those racial boundaries. This Joint Faculty Institute of Graduate Studies Friday Forum on Race will showcase groundbreaking research by scholars, staff and students here at UCL that promises to help us better understand how racial boundaries are constructed, contested and crossed. Without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker. Debbie Challis will speak to us, and she comes to us from the Petrie Museum of Archaeology.
I'm here today to talk about the Petrie Museum of Race Archaeology. Its official name is Egyptian Archaeology. And I want to start with this image of a drawer in the Petrie Museum's collection of one of the 91% of objects that aren't on display. And you may see that it's called the Memphis Race Terracottas. And it was looking at this drawer soon after working at the Petrie Museum that I realised that Petrie had this profound interest in race and had a racially determinist vision. What I didn't realise at that time, going back 5 years now, was how profound that vision was and how that affected everything he did in terms of collections, teaching materials, excavations. And so today I want to give you a snapshot of why I think the Petrie Museum could be called the Petrie Museum of Race Archaeology, in inverted commas. Firstly, just a few points about museums and race. Generally, if museums are talked about with regard to critical race thinking, it's either because they have collections of ethnographic objects or because they're somehow got collections to do with slavery, either the slave trade or materials that came across to, say, Britain or America or wherever, to do with sort of the products that slavery perhaps made or contributed to. And there's been quite a substantial amount of work done on those two areas. But generally, with regard to archaeology, that work hasn't been made in the same way. It has been, for example, one of a vase that's connected to Petrie's ideas about new race was actually on display in an exhibition about race in the Manchester Museum in 2009 to 10. But generally speaking, museums and race consciousness are sort of bracketed into sort of two areas, and that's what I want to also challenge today. So I'm going to give you some snapshots with very little analysis, really, just information about the objects, because I think everybody in this room and also looking at this online can give the analysis themselves. First of all, I want to start with Petrie before he even went to Egypt, before he was at UCL. This is his book on Stonehenge, his plans, his description and theories, and it's basically his measurements of Stonehenge. In the 1870s, he went with his father to measure some of the circles and the prehistoric kind of monuments in Wiltshire. And he wrote an article called on Metrology and Geometry, in which he argued that the perfect circle and circles in mathematics were signs of racial intelligence, and that some of the circles in Wiltshire from this prehistoric period showed sort of as much intelligence as the ancient Greeks, Egyptians, etc. So even before he went to Egypt, he had these very profound ideas about racial intelligence and things like, geometry and building monuments. While he was one of the first examples I have of his correspondence, or UCL has of his correspondence with Francis Galton, is a letter to Francis Galton, who coined the word eugenics, and we'll hear more about later in the day, about devising the perfect craniometer, i.e. for measuring skulls and heads, and I'll come to that a bit later as well. And this is actually in the Department of Statistics at UCL. It's a letter with Margaret Murray. You probably can't quite see there. And there's actually notes by Petrie with this device. In his 1885 letter to Galton, written from the site of Naucratis in response to a letter in the journal Nature, Petrie basically devises the perfect way of measuring heads, in his opinion. And this instrument seems to correspond to that. It was given to Professor George Dancer-Fane in about 1910, I think, and who was then a professor of anatomy at UCL. This is what I became very interested in when I was looking at an exhibition I was working on for the Galton Centenary a couple of years ago. These are racial photographs from Egyptian monuments in Egypt. It was a study that was made by Petrie in 1887 to 88. It was when he was freelance. And he was basically commissioned by the British Association for the Advancement of Science to go to Egypt, to different monuments in Egypt, and basically take these casts. At the time, it was photographs, but then he actually thought casts were better. So he basically made kind of moulds from the monuments of the different so-called foreign heads to try and get racial types. I'm going to come back to these a little bit later because although there's very few copies of this book and very few copies of these photographs, the casts are actually in the British Museum somewhere in store. We've got one in the Petrie Museum that we refound through recataloguing before that exhibition opened. But I'll come back to the legacy of these a bit later. This is one of the mummy portraits that Petrie excavated from Hawara. Again, this is all before he's at UCL, but this is in 1888. The reason this is important is because the mummy portraits that Petrie excavated were ascribed certain ethnic types, generally Egyptian, Greek, even Jewish. This lady was accorded Romano-Egyptian because she was slightly swarthy and Oriental looking, according to Amelia Edwards, who wrote about her. So again, the mummy portraits were ascribed these ethnic types on their sort of reception and exhibition in 1880s London. This is a head from Memphis, the same sort of place and similar to the draw that I showed you at the beginning. Memphis was a very diverse city in the ancient world. It was the second city after Alexandria during the Ptolemaic period and Roman period. This head was described as Hebrew, and it was described as Hebrew because of the way it looked. And in our old catalogue description, it was described as having a hook nose, described in a kind of anti-Semitic language. And then it accords with this book by H. Sacer, who you can see who uses one of Petrie's racial photographs on the cover of his book. And he uses the photographs or the photographs of the casts all the way through his book to basically type the races of the Old Testament, right from Genesis through to the last book of the Old Testament, which I can't remember. Anyway, this is a graph by Petrie from, again, it's nothing to do with race in terms of his publication. He's trying to talk about the visual statistics of basic data, how you can show data in a visual way. But it makes his ideas about race very clear. So it's drawing on Lamarckian ideas of climate and racial intelligence. So you have least, you have most. You'll be unsurprised to see that England is on the most. It comes from a cold climate. You've then got ancient Egypt, France. It's very much, and it's to do with skull size and skull measuring. And I said I'd come back to that. But it's a very clear indication of what Petrie's ideas are. The same year as that's published in 1902, there's an article in Biometrica published on the Nakada skulls from pre-dynastic Egypt. Petrie had thought they'd belonged to this new race that came in the intermediate period between the Old and Middle Kingdom. He then revised ideas to think of them as pre-dynastic, i.e. before the first dynasties were formed in about 3100 BC. But he still thought they were a migrating Libyan race. Now, the people behind this survey, Cicely Fawcett, Alice Lee, who worked with Carl Pearson, didn't think that at all. In fact, they rather disproved Petrie's claims, but they still thought that this would be examples of biological evolution. By measuring the data, putting it into biometric analysis, they could somehow find this. This is a photograph of Petrie with his son John at the time when John's about 18 months old. And I use this photograph really to talk about his eugenic ideas. Petrie was an absolute signed-up eugenicist. And he, the year that John was born in 1907, he published a book called Janus, and he said in that, England produces over 300,000 excess of births over deaths yearly, and perhaps a tenth more might be added to that by care of infant life. And this is at the time when the Child Welfare Act is going through, which introduced some kind of form of care. But would that tenth be of the best stock or the worst? We must agree that it would be of the lower or lowest type of careless, thriftless, dirty and incapable families, that the increase of population by 10% more of the most inferior kind. I'll leave that to speak for itself. In 1911, there was a big Congress of Race actually at University of London. And the year after, some letters were published between Petrie and W.E.B. Du Bois in The Crisis, 1912. And basically, Du Bois pretty much, he just destroys Petrie's ideas on race. I'm going to jump a little bit now, just to early Egypt, because going back to the pre-dynastic, Petrie argued that the pre-dynastic races were a migrating European race, which was disputed by the archaeologists who actually did it. Here, so I'm going to skip that one. What I want to do is finish with this letter from 1939. This is a letter about the benefits of migration. It was published in the Palestine Post. He's basically taking on the sort of National Socialist Nuremberg laws and the what's going on in Germany with regard to scientists. Petrie, though he was a eugenicist and had this racially deterministic vision, believed in the idea of migration of races. And essentially, he's arguing here that tolerance is the principle for migration of races, as long as, of course, he's arguing the best races are migrating and getting involved. So I'm just going to finish with that letter just to kind of show the complication of racial ideas and thinking about race at this period. Thank you.